is Javier Martinez, and I will be doing my refutation on the claim that Trent and Gordon presented that it had to do with the legalization or the decriminalization of LSD, and that it would have a positive impact on recreational users and on the country as a whole. His secondary claims were that acid has a positive and useful recreational effect, and I'm going to refute that by proving that LSD can have immediate negative effects on the user. His secondary claim was that acid has a positive useful medicinal effects, and I'll refute that by proving that acid has long-term psychological and emotional effects. And his last claim is that the positive effects of LSD with microdosing in the workplace. And I'll refute that by proving that this argument for microdosing is a hasty generalization and utilizes biased information. So on to my first response, that LSD can have immediate negative effects on the user. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the effects of LSD are very unpredictable because they depend on many factors. They not only depend on the person or the dosage, but also on their expectations, the mood, the environment, and also the psychological and emotional state of the person. And this is very significant because LSD takes over the nervous system, and depending on how you're feeling, it enhances that feeling. According to the same National Institute of Drug Abuse, they've stated that there's several perceptual and psychological effects. For example, emotions are felt much more intensely and much more rawly. I don't know if that's a word, but sometimes some users have reported feeling 2, 3, even more emotions at a time. They also say they have mood swings, they feel disoriented, and the obvious ones such as hallucinations, delusions. And sometimes when the dosage is large enough, users report having crossover senses where they can actually start hearing colors, or they can taste sound, things like that, which is very strange. And this is important because once things like this happen, the user will report feeling like they're losing control or they're losing their sanity. And this is what's referred to as a bad trip. This institute also mentions that the experience can last up to 12 hours. So if you can imagine yourself having a bad hallucination, which people report seeing demons, supernatural manifestations, things of the sort, for 12 hours, it can really mess with your psychological state of mind. And Trenton mentioned how some users said that it's the best experience of their life, while some other users have reported that it's actually the worst experience of their life. Now on to my second response, which is that acid has long-term psychological effects. Going with the whole bad trip thing, this kind of experience can be very traumatizing because when someone is under this influence, this really stays with them. It's very impactful on them. They're very vulnerable emotionally. LSD users have reported having flashbacks long after their trip is over, sometimes weeks, months, even years later. And this is dangerous because it can happen at any time, even while you're driving. So this is, a risk factor. And although there have been no reported deaths directly linked to LSD, many people have reported feeling paranoia, anxiety, depression, irrational fears, and in many times psychosis. And this has sometimes led to suicide. So now on to my last refutation, which is the argument for microdosing is a hasty generalization. According to the same article on the Huffington Post that Trenton used, named Microdosing and Everything You Wanted to Know, it talks about how it was administered to many mathematicians, scientists, and architects. All these people were involved using their creativity. However, it fails to address jobs such as where you really have to use your motor skills or human interaction. So as we can see, this is a bit of a fallacy of composition. Also, the information is a bit biased because the two researchers that the article talks about are Dr. Albert Hoffman, who was actually the one who discovered LSD. And one of the quotes says that he had been microdosing for at least the last couple decades of his life. So his judgment is compromised. And then the other researcher that they mention is Dr. James Fadiman, who is today's world's leading authority on psychedelic microdosing. And all this information is based on independent studies that he has conducted because they have not been approved by the National Institute Review Board. So, and he has also been microdosing as well. So we can see that his judgment is compromised. So to conclude, I would just like to prove that LSD can have immediate negative effects on the user, that it can also have long-term psychological and emotional effects, and that some of the information used in this argument was biased. Thank you.
Right, organizationally, everything is excellent. You've got a good preview of what the supporting points were. You also kind of preview what your general response is going to be on those things. I'm not sure that that's necessary to do, but since it was relatively brief, it doesn't hurt you. As you get to the first point, you immediately start citing evidence on your own, and I thought that was the strongest part of the argument on that first point, that you had substantial information that talked about all of the negative possible effects and explained the context in which those things can occur. I thought that that was pretty effective, but you do end with some arguments that I think are not as well developed on that particular point. You mention mood swings, hallucinations, crossover kinds of things. I don't get a direct quote on those particular points. And at the end, when the advocate says, they cited some people who said it was the best experience of their life, and you say, well, some people say it's the worst experience of their life. I wanted to hear from those people, and I didn't get any names. I didn't get any direct quotes. I'm not saying that what you were saying is not true. I'm just saying that you don't cite it as effectively as it could be, and that would have made a difference. I think that would make it a little bit easier to make that contrast. On the second point, I thought that you, again, kind of talked about what the potential problems are, especially from an emotional perspective. This was the least developed point. It sounds like you're repeating some of the general ideas here. There is a criticism about whether or not we're using the right kinds of people for the comparative purposes. I think you are probably conceding too quickly the benefit to people that maybe do artistic sorts of things. I would imagine that there is some reason that there are problems there, but you don't really develop anything on that, so you just basically say, yeah, but what would the effect be on people who aren't architects and artists and musicians or whatever they happen to be. For instance, if it was your brain surgeon or your psychologist, what's the impact going to be on those people when they are helping you with those problems? Would you like your dentist to be on LSD? That kind of thing. I think that I could be very creative in how I fix your teeth. At least a hypothetical example or something like that would help a little bit. On the third point on the microdosing, the idea that it's a hasty generalization, I thought that was a good argument. It says, look, we've got very limited data on this, and then you go right after the data, you say it comes from these two sources, both of whom are, one who invented it and has been microdosed the rest of his life, and the other one who is doing it outside of approved research tools. None of the studies are approved by any institution or organization that reviews these kinds of things, and this person's microdosing also. So maybe we shouldn't be allowing this kind of information to influence us in some way. I think that that's a reasonable press to make on that point. Okay, thank you.